Hello and welcome back. Today this is a Sunday, so this may be a better day for recording. I do not know how I got a Sunday off, but it begs to question what is fate. On this great Lord's Day, I just have an idea to say, and it sounds a little messy, especially for Christians to be able to answer, but I think that it's beautiful in the way that it comes across, in the way that it's solved. Today I was wanting to talk more about how we are made in the image of God, and this is going to sound absolutely bonkers, but the scientific evidence around us actually points towards this. And it's not like I'll get to why I believe we are created beings, but we're going to set that aside for right now. So for those of you who do not understand the way matter works, protons and neutrons are in the center of an atom surrounded by electrons. One of the cool things about electrons is that they can be either in the physical negative energy state, or they can be in the state of light as, what are they called? I forget what they are when they are a form of light, but they can swap back and forth between light and physical material. Now, of course, their weight is negligible, but that isn't the useful part about them. First of all, they are negatively charged subatomic particles that sit basically like 5, 10, 30 football fields away, depending upon where they're located on the atom. But the other cool part is that it's not just that they shift back and forth. You don't know which form it is unless you're inspecting it. And in fact, at that rate, it may as well technically be both at the same time. So in order to explain why this is important, imagine these little islands of tiny balls that are positively charged, clustered with these slightly bigger balls that are neutrally charged that just give it mass, right? These little islands that are that could easily be several miles apart from each other, that are connected by what looks like these tiny little rafts that also are light. And the really cool part is light behaves in waves, and because of that, so do these electrons. Even though they orbit, like they have a field of influence around the atom that they're connected to, they behave in waves. So like they are partially deterministic fields that connect these atoms, these little islands together. And the part that they are partially deterministic is really cool. And in case you want to understand what that means, like, we can technically solve for the range that an atom is going to be within. It's not entirely random, and because of that, there are equations that you can set up such that you can know the range that it's going to be located in whenever you are trying to observe an electron. And why am I bringing this up? If you zoom out a tiny bit, you won't act like, I shouldn't say tiny bit, like if you take magnitudes out, just a few magnitudes out from a zoom, you won't necessarily see the little islands of the charged particles. You will see these clouds of electrons bouncing around, either barely bouncing around, like they're going to be connected, but they're going to be shifting either slightly or drastically, or they're not even going to be connected at all, but they will shift around slightly. But there's a music about them because they're all moving in waves. And in fact, they have to be creating some kind of chorus, because otherwise, if they're disjointed, the atoms won't be able to, like, just because the electrons are so close together, they have to interact with each other. And because of that, you're going to get waves, you're going to get currents, you're going to get rhythms like heartbeats, you're going to get pulses, you're going to get collision, but to without reference, like without anything to reference to, it looks random, but somehow humans can decipher that it looks like an orchestra at that level. And why am I saying that? It's because humans aren't just meaning-making machines. We literally perceive order and beauty out of what looks like complete chaos. And how do I mean by that? I mean, when you are watching a screen, like a phone screen or a computer screen, and you're watching a movie or a video, to the rest of the world it seems random. But to you, you can make out the shapes, you can actually identify what a face is, eyes, ears. You can identify. You don't have to have sound to know that those are humans. You can understand the tones that are applied based upon whether you've identified them as male or female. You can suggest tones that apply. And this is all because we inherently are we overderive patterns from chaos, such that the strongest patterns are stories, and the strongest stories have archetypal characters, and the highest level story that we have identified is the hero myth. And that kind of sounds extremely separate from saying watching a river flow, but there's a story within that river. These water molecules are flowing in this direction in general, but they're also creating currents within, and it looks, if you watch a stream and you are willing to expand your terms of symphony, once you remove it just from sound that you take in and you apply it to the visual that you see, a stream looks like a symphony. And even though the electrons themselves, like even though the atoms themselves don't experience a story, we experience a story given to them. We may not be able to see the start, but we can infer the start of their journey, probably up in the clouds. They fall down in rain, or if it's in the air, it condenses in the dew in the mornings, or it condenses up in the sky in clouds and then again comes down as rain. And as it hits the ground, it starts traveling down to its lowest energy potential place it can be, which means it just falls with gravity down to the lowest point that it can attain. And sometimes it pools up, and that's where it ends up for a while until it evaporates. And actually, that atom won't actually stay there at the bottom of the pool because temperatures change. And also, if you haven't noticed, it's still a symphony. Like, even when it's low in a pond somewhere, that water is constantly moving. And in fact, in North America, we have the season called fall, and it's actually one of the reasons why it's called fall instead of autumn is because our ponds actually shift water locations based on temperature, because I forget the exact method, the exact way it does it, but our lakes actually cycle. And that sounds crazy to a lot of people, but you could imagine that there's water, even though it is sitting in a pond, it is constantly moving. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that it has energy, it has heat. Whether it's at the top or the bottom, it has different amounts of heat, so it's going to move. And in fact, all molecules and all atoms are constantly in motion, and I'm going to put it like this. Each creature has an ability to see and infer an amount of information based on the way molecules move. If it's a single cell amoeba, it can tell what its surroundings are. It knows. I shouldn't say knows. It can take in materials, excrete materials. It has receptors that get bound to things on the outside. It'll bring them in, or it'll spit things out. It'll excrete water and waste. But it can identify things on the outside. It doesn't have quite as good of senses as, let's say, the next step up would be algae, because algae has a special light sensing organelle that lets it move towards light. And there's other single cell organisms that have similar things that let them identify where things are and lets them move towards them or away from them. And then as you go up complexity levels, individual cells still have some of those capabilities, like muscle cells respond specific ways to certain amounts of calcium and sodium, while brain cells respond different ways to the presence of glucose in your bloodstream versus there being, like, it will use glucose when there's enough of it around, but if there's below a certain level, it will use lipids, and oftentimes those will be the lipids that your body produces. This goes on and on and on, up and down the chain, up and down the complexity hierarchy of living organisms. And it is my belief that as human beings, we can find meaning and beauty in the things that are lower. And a lot of that has to do with our hyper-driven ability to detect patterns and to, as a form of, how do I put this? As a evolutionary technology that we have built into our brains, we are religious. Just, I don't know if it's evolutionary or God put it there, and I'm thinking it's God put it there because it's almost impossible to create it from evolution. But we are religious, so therefore we can identify archetypes, we can identify stories, we can identify starts and plot, and we can identify arcs, and we can identify climaxes, and we can identify completions, and we know how stories work. In fact, our lives are run by them, and our brains run in stories. Our perceptions are run in stories. We have our brains rely on framing, and you have to have framing, and you have to have religion, and like the religion is part of the framing matrix for the world around you, plus your religion builds a frame for your brain to function within, because your brain has to filter out something like you only register about one thousandth amount of the information that comes in through your senses. And to demonstrate that, if you walk outside when it's cold outside, your body acclimates to the temperature, or when it's hot outside. After like an hour or so, it doesn't feel nearly the same temperature as it was when you walked outside 2 seconds ago. You feel the drastic shift in temperature, but then your body acclimates. Where was I going with that? Anyways, our brains rely on stories and settings, and religion is one of those settings that our brain has incorporated. And our brain sees, I'll use the word symphonies because the world around us is orchestrated. It's self-containing orchestration. So like obviously like spiders know what they're doing when they're building webs, and ants know what they're doing as a colony, but each ant has a different, like they know their job, but they have different, like they follow the same path, but does each ant know which one is the start of the line? Does it matter? Whenever they're just out exploring, each one is the start of their own journey, right? Different beings have different perceptions of what's going on around them, and most beings have smaller and smaller stories with smaller amounts of complexity. And humans just happen to be able to be so self-aware that we can identify our own worldview. Now, where does this lead to? In my line of work as a front-end supervisor, I know I orchestrate the front end. It looks like madness if you are looking at it from the outside, but people know who's in charge. And at night, that is me. They may see that the person in front of them has a lot of agency, but they know who gets called when there's questions, or when there's something they need my authority to do. And sometimes I just tell them point blank, you have my authority to take care of these things. Like I grant you my authority. You have my permission to do these things on your own. You can tell if there's any questions, you can tell whoever is above me that I gave you permission to do these things. The world is a mixture of those who do things and those who, how do I put this? This is the wrong rabbit hole to go down. But I do find it beautiful that from the bottom up we see that the world is, I shouldn't say orchestrated. Like it is, but that's not the point here. The point is you can watch the beauty of the world, and like humans are in this way made in the image of God, because we can identify patterns, we can identify patterns from within the chaos. If you read Genesis 1, part of it is a decision matrix, and part of it is like Genesis 1 is about, how do I put it? Part of Genesis 1 is, if you read it as though you are God and you're not creating but you're identifying things, it's a decision matrix to identify what kind of creature you're working with. Does it fly? It has to have these certain traits. And like you can't make, This is part of what Jonathan Pajot was saying in his most recent discussion with Peter Boghossian, which was kind of cool. Snails will never be able to fly. You can't make the theoretical matrix around the idea that in a different world snails could fly, because they have to meet certain perimeters, and snails could never get there from where they're at right now. And it's useless to try to hypothesize that it meets those requirements in a different universe, because snails are snails. They are really, really aqueous. They secrete all sorts of liquids just in order to be able to move. They are very slow. They're oozy, and they're squishy, and they are slimy, and some of them have shells, and they're not birds. There's no way you can create a matrix such that you can identify a different reality where snails fly, if you get my drift. As humans, we are able to identify different things. Like we're able to sort out the world around us, and that is part of a way that we are like God. And that's one of the beautiful things about us. We're not just meaning-making machines, even though that is a big part of it. And in case you're wondering, like, how all this works, why are we any different from the animals? Our eyes, just to put things into perspective, this is something that you have to just figure out, or to understand what I'm trying to get at. I'll put it like this. Our ears just receive audio input. Whenever we record audio, the program we're using and the tools we have available are just recording frequencies and tones, and our brain, when we hear it back, is interpreting the pattern such that we can recognize speech, and that we can recognize what is being said and interpret it. Our eyes are just getting in what colors go where. Our brains are what is able to identify text and identify shapes and identify tools and identify structures. Our brains make the sense of things. And animals have their own way of doing it at a smaller level, but what makes humans so amazing is that we can identify things above us because we have such strong pattern recognition. So when Jonathan Pajot starts talking about little gods being the structures that were there, no, like, I wouldn't say the structures, the categories that were there before things fell into them, before there were physical beings created. So, like, the ability to fly, humans aren't ever going to be able to fly that way. That category was there before beings were created. They had to meet the requirements, the physical attributes, in order to be able to perform the task at hand. Right? Humans, we needed to be able to grab things in order to be able to throw things, in order to be able to hunt the way we hunt. We sacrificed a lot of our hair in order to create pores so that we could sweat, so we could run, right? There were things that had to be, there were requirements set by the world before the beings themselves could adapt to meet those requirements. And as humans, we're able to identify those things. There's no way a dog's going to be able to identify, hey, wait, there's a reason why Even though I'm faster than him, he can still chase me down, right? There's no reason a dog's going to be able to identify that. Or a zebra. Or, you get the idea. There's no way a dog's going to be able to identify. There's a reason why I can't catch that bird, other than the fact that it's higher than me. It won't be able to identify that bird is higher than me because it has these physical characteristics that allow it to fly. And in fact, that stretches beyond just being able to identify the gods that Jonathan Pajot is talking about. I'm going to call them spirits, whether they be angels or demons, and there's a reason why, or just categories. The reason why I say there's angels and demons is because the angels and demons I believe in are the agents that are created by humans by our interaction between each other. So let's say if I were to have a conversation with someone, there is a being between the two of us, which it's like a really small agent called the conversation. So when you go up and ask a girl out, there's a conversation between the two of you, and it has all sorts of rules, and there's all sorts of responsibilities between the two people that enter into that conversation, or else that conversation, if both those people don't hold up to it, will shift in ways that either one or the other doesn't want, and that eventually that conversation falls apart. Right? So when you go up and ask a girl for her number, if you're confident enough and she knows you a little bit, so that way there's some familiarity, like you can probably do it. But if you're just to go up and do it to a stranger, there's going to be a much higher burden, right? Because there's different expectations depending upon how much you know each other. Sort of, you know what I mean? But it's because the essence of the agent that you've created by entering that conversation has changed. It's a different being because there's different expectations from each of you. And that expands outwards. So a church is an agent. The community of a church is an agent. As people move throughout the church, different people will cluster together with different people, unintentionally or intentionally, and different conversations will happen. But the people who are within that church are affected by the agent of the church. So within a church, there are going to be specific conversations that are going to be that the community is going to be shifted towards. You're obviously going to be talking more about God. You're going to be talking about your family. You're not going to be talking about the affair that you've been having behind your wife's back. You may talk about that with your guy friends, and may is a very strange word there because that's extremely rare. But you will talk about it with the woman that you've been having the affair behind your wife with, right? Like there's different expectations in each setting. In fact, the setting determines the conversations you're going to have. The frame that you're in at the moment will determine the people, like the way in which you'll interact with the people around you in the world that you're in. So if you're on a first date with a woman, if you're in a higher class restaurant, then and you present yourself as really well dressed, and you're sitting across from the other person, from the other woman, or if you're a gay guy, if you're on a date with another guy, if you're sitting across from the person, everyone's going, like, you're both going to be really tense because one, you're sitting apart from each other. That actually has different that has a different way of interacting than if you're sitting beside someone. You're sitting at a fancy restaurant, in a fancy restaurant, so there's expectations of you while you're inside the restaurant. There's expectations that you've set by dressing up. You're going to behave in such a way, so that way the other person's going to infer that they need to behave in that certain way. You create the tone of the agent that you enter into with the other person. And the reason why I'm using that language is because you also create the tone of your marriage as you're in the marriage, right? Actually, when you enter a marriage, it is no longer about you or the other person, it's about the marriage. We create agents all the time. And we're actually able to, we don't use that language, but once you start using language, you can start to work and identify the agents you create, and you can start, with enough experience, you can start adjusting the tones of those agents. It's not just rules to a game, it's deeper than that, because it's allowed to move, it's allowed to shift, it's allowed to, you're allowed to negotiate with it. If you play Magic the Gathering, the rules are pretty set in stone unless you have cards that let you change the rules a little bit. You're allowed to negotiate with that agent. It's a living being, right? I know that sounds weird, but it's actually, you can think of it as like a multi-cell organism. So I'm going to start painting a picture from the bottom up. And this is sort of how you start to imagine Genesis 1. So a single cell organism has the vast majority of single cell, I'll say, for the sake of this conversation, single cell organisms are defined by those who have how's the right wording here? I can see the picture in my head. A lipid bilayer capsule around them with enough working machinery inside that they can self-replicate. No, that's not even that. They have enough working machinery inside of them that they can perform functions separate from the outside world, and that they can replicate in some way. So that means they need to have a message that identifies them as them. So this would be, for the basics, it would be RNA, but most organisms that you're going to encounter have DNA centers. A lot of bacteria have RNA, but a lot of them also have DNA. But the most of the things that you see around you are going to have DNA in them. So I'm going to use DNA for right now. DNA centers, it doesn't have to be a nucleus, but a way that the DNA can be interacted with without too many things getting into the cell. Sometimes that means the cell can't bring in certain things because there's not any room for play. And this is where a lot of multi-cell organisms start including a nucleus. So that way they can bring in other things that would normally interact with the DNA that now has a second barrier. Anyway, so you have a cell that is a capsule of, it's an opposing lipid capsule. So that way it's an opposing phospholipid capsule. And what I mean by phospholipid is there's a phosphorus holding two lipids together. And actually the phosphoruses are on the outsides, and there's a layer, there's two layers of lipids inside. And actually, in order to bring stuff in, it can't just be that. You actually need receptors, and you need specific organelles. You need specific proteins that allows it to pinch off parts of that outer layer to bring stuff in. And that organelle is, I forget the name of it right off. But I'm a biologist, so I'm trying to explain things without using the specific names so that way you understand. It pinches off a little bubble once something is attached to it and brings it in, or it can have ports that allow specific molecules in. So like there are specific ports on the outside layer of most cells that let you bring in glucose, because glucose is the main material used for energy, especially at single cell level, at really basic organism level. They just convert glucose to they convert it down to an alcohol and use the energy expended from the conversion to do their intercellular processes. And that isn't even including a mitochondria that is like some of the machinery inside would include ribosomes, and you'd have to have a DNA transcriber to get some RNA to transcribe proteins. That's like the bare minimums you need. You need a DNA transcriptase, you need a ribosome, and you need a way to make nucleic acids. Those are the bare minimums. And that's not even, like, that's just assuming, like, outside of you there's all sorts of amino acids floating around that you can pull in, and there's all sorts of glucose around you that you can pull in. That's a single cell, and that sounds super complex, but like once you start to understand what's in a normal cell, what's in an average single cell organism, you're like, whoa, that's not even close to everything that they have. If you look at a human cell, we have endoplasmic reticulum, we have all sorts of proteins and extra capsules to force the proteins that we print off to fold correctly. We have, instead of plasmids for DNA, just plasmids are like little hula hoops of DNA, and you can just have the DNA transcriptase just run in circles to print off whatever you need. We have massive chromosomes. When I'm saying massive, I'm saying it. While this isn't the correct amount, but to put it into perspective, a bacteria can probably have some number of gigabytes of data. We have petabytes of data in chromosomes, and humans have 46 of them. Yeah, and don't talk to me about the males having a tiny one. Don't worry about that. It's still important. Humans have immense amounts of data in our cells, and a lot of times there's actually duplicates of genes. And in fact, a lot of genes code for multiple different proteins, because we have some genes that will code for different that will code when signaled for specific other signals that will force DNA to be printed. No, for RNA to be cut in specific ways and rejoined to print different proteins from the same gene. Inside a single cell organism, there are several very complex machines, and I forget where I was going with this. I think the general idea is that inside a single cell organism, at the lowest level of creation that we can think of, that is animate, that will perform functions, that will do work, it is extremely complex inside. As you go up the chain of complexity, the hierarchy of complexity, different cells start taking on very specific roles, and by the time you get to something like a badger, muscle cells are joined with all sorts of filaments, and skin cells are actually dead on the outside layer actually has a whole bunch of dead skin cells, and there's all sorts of hair, there's all sorts of things that are produced by cells. And cells are so specialized that, literally, there are cells that literally just produce hair. Think about that. On the outside of the body, there are cells that literally just produce hair, and in fact, like that hair is super complex. Just think about the collar patterns on badgers. Each of those little hairs is coded by is made by a specific cell, which is coded in such a specific way that it makes that specific hair follicle. And like, you have different color hairs on you. And that's just like different cells get cycled through at different times. Like, you actually have to cycle through your hair cells. I don't know if you understand this, but like, when you get ingrown hairs under your skin, that's your cells trying to cycle through, and one of them just starts growing hair in the wrong place, and that hurts, right? Our bodies are super complex, and that also means our interpretation of the world is super complex. And the reason why I'm saying this is because I'll use my line of work as an example. As a supervisor, the front end is you can think of the front end as like a tissue of the store I work in. There's dairy, there's frozen, there's grocery, there's meat, there's someone that does the accounting. I know one of the two specific people personally that does all of the time punch accounting. Her name is Nina. She's awesome. Anyways, there are people that do very specific, very important jobs. I'm one of them. I am like the cell that gets interfaced from I'm like a hybrid cell. I interface with the nerve cells above me that are giving me direct information to do certain things. And I still do some of the nerve cell kind of things. And the front end is, how do I put this? The front end is like I don't know. The front end is like a face. The face of a business, right? Like, you see the front end. Actually, no, I would think the front end is more like, how do I put this? There's not a very clear direct connection, but I'll put it like this. Different entities have different tasks that need to be performed for them to continue to function. So why would a spirit need to eat food, right? Or why would a spirit need to blink? So spirits don't need muscles the same way humans do. In fact, spirits have different things that they need to do to complete tasks. They have different interests, because each being has different interests. A dog's going to want to play, and it's going to want to get social attention from humans and other dogs. And that's just how dogs are. They're going to want to eat different things. Their bodies use certain proteins and certain materials differently than humans. Dogs have different interests than humans. And the next thing that you're going to have, and once you understand that, the question becomes like, what do spirits want? And I'm not quite there yet. And it may be that spirits are there to serve us. And I think that is actually biblically sound. The spirits that are there to serve us are angels. And actually, if you want to know a spirit that you interact with every day, and I mean literally every day, not the moment that you wake up, but very soon after, humans were so self-aware that we created government. I mean, literally, government is a spirit. In America, we created the government through this thing called a Bill of Rights. Like, we created we set parameters to create a government. We set up first 10 amendments, freedom of speech, press, religion, and association, right to bear arms. None of these shall be infringed, period. We create a spirit that is there to serve us. And right now, we are in a tyranny because that spirit because we've slowly given it more and more power, that spirit has flipped on us and now we serve it, sadly. And that should be scary. In fact, that sort of is one of the issues of, what's the right term here? Of an opulent lifestyle, right? Like, as you start giving power to spirits because you don't want to take on those responsibilities, those spirits slowly become things that you fear instead of that fear you. They're not there as much to serve you as you are to serve them. As you start giving them more power and authority, they start doing more things that you don't want them to do because they have their own will, and they have their own functions that they need to complete. And you don't always know what those are, and God have mercy on us when we create spirits that we don't know what their functions are. And I think that's going to bring this episode to a close because this gets a little wonky from here on out. But the world is beautiful, and I think that the only reason why there is beauty is because humans see it, we perceive it, we can create it too. We are my terminology is we are mortal instruments in the service of God, or the gods, or whatever. And we choose to worship the Lord God Almighty because He is our highest standard, and because He has given us a life worth living if we pick up our cross and follow Him. And that doesn't mean it'll be easy, but it does mean that after enough time that we've done enough self-reflecting and we've judged ourselves based on the standards He's given us, that we can start to see the world around us in a much deeper manner. And the world is beautiful because He sacrificed Himself so that way we have something to follow after. We now have a standard for sacrifice. And back in the days of the Jews, sacrifice was what you did because that's what God told you. Now sacrifice is what you do because you're following after it's not just the will of God, which is, funnily enough, the right terminology. You're not just following after the will of God, you are picking up your cross and following His standard. And that is beautiful too. And there's a lot of symbolism there, which I will want to discuss at some point. So thank you all for your time. And I guess if you found any insight, please like, subscribe, share. I do want to grow this channel, but we'll see where it goes. Have a nice day.